Fragmentation and essential incompletion. The idea of totality and its self-presentation causes an incompletion that is at the same time the ultimate fulfillment of the idea in absolute individuality. The idea of totality, by attempting to present itself, produces incompletion, not accidentally, not as a failure of execution, but necessarily as the direct consequence of what totality is, the complete, unlimited, unbounded whole. But any act of presentation must take specific, finite, bounded form. A sentence, fragment, a system, a concept given determinate shape. However, given that totality exceeds every finite form, every act of self-presentation immediately reveals that the presentation falls short. Here, Gachet argues, this incompletion is not what prevents fulfillment. It is fulfillment in its most ultimate, most rigorous form. To understand why, the concept of absolute individuality must be addressed. If the idea of totality could be presented completely, gathered into a single, closed, exhaustive form, it would immediately cease to be absolute. It would become finite, bounded, determined by the limits of its own container. The very act of total presentation would annihilate what it sought to present. Incompletion is therefore not what the idea suffers when presentation fails. It is what the idea requires in order to remain what it is. Fragment, singular, finite, irreducible, becomes the site where the idea achieves its most intense presence precisely because it does not exhaust it. Each fragment presents the idea in a form that is complete as an individuality while simultaneously open to excess that no individuality can contain. One can then speak of a productive tension, the tension between individuality and totality, between the finite form of the fragment and the infinite idea it carries. Fragmentation holds thought inside it, permanently, generatively, without closure. Each fragment is a singular fulfillment, not despite its incompletion, but through it, because of it, as its very mode of being. Key idea, the idea does not fulfill itself by overcoming incompletion, it fulfills itself by becoming absolutely individual, and absolute individuality is only possible through the incompletion that totality, by its very nature, cannot avoid producing. The fragment is where the absolute arrives, partially, intensely, irrevocably. This condition appears through displaced planes and incomplete enclosures that suggest the structure of a box without fully enclosing it. The fragments do not reconstruct a complete form. Instead, they present the idea of enclosure while keeping it unresolved. The gaps between the planes play a crucial role. These intervals are not missing elements but active spatial conditions that maintain tension between enclosure and openness. Through this arrangement, the model demonstrates what Gachet describes as essential incompletion produced by presentation. The whole appears only through fragments, and completion would actually destroy the fragment's function. The model, therefore, does not represent fragmentation as loss. Instead, it shows fragmentation as the condition through which a spatial system becomes perceptible while remaining open, incomplete, and continuously interpreted. The initial text records the site as a linear sequence of events, focusing on observation and narrative. The developed AI version reinterprets the same experience through spatial conditions, movement, atmosphere, memory, and occupation, shifting the reading from static description to phenomenological analysis. Reading of the site. In the first photo montage, the children run freely across the garden, expressing a space that once invited play, openness, and spontaneity. The garden reads as continuous, light, and socially alive, a condition that reflects an earlier relationship between people and public space. In contrast, the second condition shows children moving slowly, burdened, and disconnected, suggesting how the same garden today is experienced with heaviness, fragmentation, and reduced engagement. The montage, therefore, does not depict people, but reveals how the atmosphere of the garden has shifted over time. The site as visual field frames the site where perception is inherently partial and constructed through fragments rather than a unified whole. What is revealed is always mediated by what is concealed, framed, or obstructed, producing misalignments, gaps, and discontinuities across the field. In this sense, fragmentation is not only a spatial condition but a perceptual one, where the image of the site resists synthesis into a single coherent reading. Essential incompletion follows from this. The site cannot be fully resolved or exhausted as an image, but remains open-ended, requiring the viewer to actively reconstruct spatial relationships. Site analysis. Surrounding institutional masses frame the garden, defining it as a spatial pause within the city. The garden emerges as a central void within a dense urban fabric, emphasizing openness against the surrounding built mass. Pedestrian and vehicular flows converge at the edges, establishing the garden as a threshold and negotiated entry into the site. Noise dissipates and calm emerges toward the interior, creating a gradient of perception from urban intensity to contemplative quiet. Daily rhythms reveal active edges and quieter interior zones, highlighting temporal occupation and retreat within the garden. My design hypothesis. I propose a DJ-VJ booth on the National Library garden in which fragmentation and essential incompletion is the primary spatial strategy. The continuous garden and its terraces are broken into distinct fragments, vertical volumes, displaced planes, and circulation terraces that mediate between the elevated institutional mass of the library and the lower public ground. Each fragment functions as an autonomous microsystem, internally coherent yet relationally connected to surrounding fragments, allowing totality to emerge indirectly. The intervals between fragments become zones of engagement, thresholds, and visual corridors, activating movement, curiosity, and sequential perception. Fragmentation here is not a sign of incompleteness. It is generative, structuring space, producing experiential diversity, and establishing a relational dialogue between institution and public ground. The proposal spatializes the site's latent potential through fragments, emphasizing atmospheric, visual, and bodily connections without imposing a continuous object. In this A1 model of the DJ-VJ dwelling, fragmentation structures the spatial and volumetric composition within the library garden. The booth functions as a central fragment, mediating between the elevated library and the terraced garden while resting lightly on the ground to preserve topographical continuity. Displaced planes, voids, and gaps establish thresholds and sequential paths, guiding movement and perceptual exploration. Fragments are autonomous yet relational, generating spatial tension, curiosity, and layered experiences without ever fully enclosing or completing the space. The terraces, planes, and intervals articulate inside-outside continuity by revealing the latent historical, ecological, and sensory conditions. The insert does not relate to the ground in a single way. On one side, it rests slightly on the terraces, preserving ground continuity. On the left side, however, the booth deliberately cuts into the garden and becomes partially embedded in the soil. Because only one portion is embedded, water can still pass through most of the site. The fragments are positioned to avoid tree root zones and align with existing trees. Vegetation is not background, becomes a spatial partner framed by the planes. The insert does not create a new path. It sits along existing movement lines and gently redirects people into pause points between the fragments. The displaced planes create shaded pockets and allow air to pass through, producing cooler micro-zones within the garden. The project does not erase existing geometries. It aligns with the terraces and preserves the historical organization of the garden. The insert is clearly contemporary, but its scale and proportion remain quiet and respectful to the site. Because it rests slightly and is fragmented, the insert can be removed without damaging the site. Fragment as spatial mediator. The dwelling does not arrive as an object but as a quiet disturbance in the garden's continuity. From afar, it reads as a thin silhouette against the calm ground. As one approaches, the planes separate and depth begins to appear between them. The fragment turns flat landscape into layered space, where people slip through intervals rather than enter a form. Light and shadow gather inside the gaps, and the garden is no longer a background, but an active field that the fragment reframes. What we see here is not placement, but a shift in how the site is perceived, approached, and inhabited.